I'm going to go ahead and introduce Riley to you, so Riley can begin our program with Sue's introduction. Riley Saunders is a senior intelligence and national security major here at Coastal Carolina University. He is also in Army ROTC and doing the military science minor. And Riley is planning to commission as a military intelligence officer in the Army Reserves when he graduates in May of 2021. Riley also had the opportunity to do an internship at the State Department in Western Hemispheric affairs, and found that was an area he really enjoyed and worked in the State Department. So his goal, his plans are to pursue a career as a Foreign Service officer at the State Department. So we hope that Riley's able to do that. So Riley, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can introduce our speaker.
Hey, Dr. Kilroy, thank you for that. So like you mentioned, today we will be hearing from Sue Kim. Sue Kim is a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and an adjunct instructor at American University. Her research interests include the Korean Peninsula, Russia, Indo-Pacific strategy, near-peer competition, decision-making, propaganda, and the intelligence community. She served as an analyst in the Central Intelligence Agency and has also worked at the Department of Homeland Security. A native Korean speaker, Kim is a contributor to the Nikkei Asian Review, the Lowy Institute's The Interpreter, and has published articles in The Hill, The Diplomat, The National Interest, National Review, and other publications. She comments frequently on Korean Peninsula and East Asia issues in international media, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, CNN, PBS, Bloomberg, Voice of America, BBC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Handelsblatt, Chosun Ilbo, and Donga Ilbo. Kim has earned a bachelor's in French from Yale University and a master's in international relations and strategic studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Everybody, Kim Sue.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Dr. Kilroy and CCU, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to share my humble perspectives on a topic that I frankly never really get tired of talking about. Before we actually delve into the discussion today, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to just give you a quick intro or overview of my organization, the RAND Corporation. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution that helps policy and decision-making through objective and data-driven analysis. We were established in 1948 by the Douglas Aircraft Company to conduct research for the US military. So today, our research is actually funded by US government, private endowments, corporations, universities, and private individuals. Our research actually runs quite the gamut. We're primarily known for our contributions in the defense and national security space, but given our research divisions in Project Air Force, Arroyo, that's the Army, but we also have prolific research and analysis portfolios in Homeland Security, education and labor, healthcare, social and economic well-being, and the National Security Research Division. We also have a global footprint. So we're headquartered in Santa Monica, California. I work in DC, but a substantial portion of our national security and defense research is actually done in the nation's capital. We also have locations in Pittsburgh, Boston, Brussels, Cambridge, and Canberra, Australia. One of RAND's fortes or competitive edge stems from its emphasis on cross-disciplinary analysis. So most of our research efforts are rather large. Sometimes we move a little bit slower than other companies, but we try to take a strategic, longer-term perspective in looking at geopolitical or even current issues like the COVID-19 pandemic. So in keeping with today's, or I guess the program's theme writ large, great decisions in foreign policy, I wanted to open up today's discussion with one key, broad, and very simplistic question, that is, what is the great decision for the Korean Peninsula? Or rather, what should the decision be, or the great decision be, for the Korean Peninsula? I start with this question for several reasons, and I'm going to pull up a map of the Korean Peninsula. So we left off with the question, what is the great decision for the Korean Peninsula? Or rather, What should the great decision be? And I'm starting with this question for several reasons, and I've just posted up the map of the Korean Peninsula to give you a better geographical orientation of the two Koreas, North Korea above the 30th parallel and South Korea below. I want us to sort of think about the two Koreas, not just within that constrained map, but to think about the broader question about North Korea nuclear weapons, the cyber capabilities, the past 4 years of US North Korea diplomacy, where it was not just the two parties that were involved, but we saw other countries in the region that wanted to claim their interests, maybe not so directly at times, but it turned out to be less of a bilateral or a strictly North-South or North Korea-US relationship, but it had broader geographical and strategic implications. So I want us to think about that as I continue to talk to you about the current state of the Korean Peninsula. So I'm starting with this question for several reasons. And one, this is where the historical experience or knowledge does come in handy. But when observing today's recent diplomacy and efforts to engage in a deal with North Korea over its nuclear ballistic missile programs, it was unclear what decision we were actually trying to pursue. For all intents and purposes, the stated goal was, of course, the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. But then again, stating a goal, and publicly so, actually proved to be, it equated to little in terms of direction and substance. So in policymaking, there's this challenge of matching policy articulation with implementation. So, of course, we know that policymaking, as with any decision that humans make, it's not a science. It involves interaction, behavior, much of which is not really controllable by any party. So we may set out to establish a particular policy, but there are contingencies, prioritization of issues, and I strongly believe our own intellectual, perceptual, and moral limitations that continue to pose constraints in perfectly boxing out a strategy and then moving forward as if we're sort of following a script. Practically speaking, the Trump administration arguably did not have a strategy dealing with North Korea from the beginning. In short, going back to the theme, there was no critical question or critical decision serving as the anchor of their North Korea strategy. And this was made apparent to many Korea observers when the South Korean delegation announced in front of the White House on March 2018 that North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un was committed to denuclearization, not of North Korea, but of the Korean Peninsula. So this was not really a matter of semantics, I would argue, but a critical omission that would dictate the terms of the United States' subsequent dealings with North Korea. And then by accepting the invitation for talks on the spot, then pursuing subsequent summits, working level meetings through political whims, personal interests, and based on what appeared to be little operable substantive knowledge as a foundation, we actually found ourselves embroiled in these theatrics and this faint glimmer of hope. This hope it seemed like it was based on little evidence, that the unconventional approach of using top-down diplomacy may actually prove to be effective and actually work this time. But then without a clear critical decision to work towards, our approach towards North Korea, and also in dealing with our allies and partners in the region, actually proved to be inconsistent and at times incoherent. So I'll leave it up to the audience to decide whether we, as in not just the United States, but the international community, are finding ourselves much better off now in 2021 After the summitry, the promises of closing the door on 70 years of war and hostility on the Korean Peninsula. Number two, critically throughout the whole summitry and even in the working level talks with our South Korean counterparts, I would say that there had been critical decision points. For instance, our interlocutors from DC during a working level deliberation, they must have faced the critical decision or great decision moment of deciding whether the costs of continuing negotiations or continuing to convince the North Koreans to talk to us based on the frame that was dictated by North Korea, or the cost of holding another summit with Kim Jong-un clearly outweighed the benefits. And each of these decisions, I would say, had a cumulative effect on our ability to maneuver. It also determined our ability to put our foot down, so to speak, to any demands that the North Koreans would make. So these small, seemingly trivial decision points ended up being, in my opinion, very critical decisions. So then we're going to pivot back to the drawing board, so to speak. So what is the great decision for the Korean Peninsula? The answer, I would say, depends really on which side of the globe we're sitting in. So there are, of course, convergent points in US, South Korean, and also more broadly, Northeast Asian policies toward the Korean Peninsula. More precisely, of course, the North Korea problem. There's really no disagreement that all sides view the North Korean nuclear program as the biggest problem to varying degrees. There's also little disagreement that all parties want to establish some form of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Then the question is, how will we arrive at this destination called peace? And do all parties actually see the North Korea problem or the issue as one of equal gravity? So, for instance, the United States, by and large, we want to see the North Korean nuclear issue resolved. The nuclear threat allows the leader Kim Jong-un and his regime to survive. It's able to wield coercive leverage over its neighbors. And it also allows North Korea to continue to disrupt stability and security in the region. It feeds Kim Jong-un, literally and figuratively, and it's proven to be the most effective blank check in guaranteeing his regime's relevance and existence as a force, or in my opinion, dead weight to be reckoned with. From Washington's optics, the elimination of the North Korean nuclear threat allows us to not only weaken the will of the North Korean regime to provoke, but it's perhaps the one single way we can actually work towards or chip away towards establishing an enduring peace on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, on the other hand, seems to cast peace in a different light. And I think I need to emphasize here that when I'm talking about South Korea in this context, we're talking specifically about the current presidential administration under Moon Jae-in. So Seoul aims to reach peace by placing the nuclear issue on the slow back burner. This is going to, of course, allow Kim Jong-un to build his nuclear arsenal, to prioritize actually the goal of improving inter-Korean relations. Recently, it's been discovered that the South Korean government may have actually conceived of plans to help North Korea build a nuclear power plant. This was in pursuit while the South Korean administration tried to or take steps to shut down their own nuclear reactor. So while engaging with North Korea to pursue inter-Korean rapprochement, South Korea was effectively, not just through the nuclear dismantlement, but through other very tolerant, patient, generous steps vis-a-vis North Korea. South Korea has been slowly but surely weakening its own defenses and ultimately really creating more obstacles to establishing this peace that we all want in the region. So Seoul and Washington's positions, their limits, their parameters for dealing with North Korea seems to be really diverging more and more with time. Complicating this, of course, are the other regional players. So we're talking China, Japan, Russia, the countries which also have varying interests and levels of involvement in establishing a peace regime. So quickly, talking about China, we know that the current US administration has really focused on the China threat all around. The priority is there so that the United States can better deal with China. The long-term competition between Washington and Beijing seems to be going through cycles. But I would say that it is actually intensifying, not because the two sides are becoming more belligerent towards each other, but because the prevalence and the rising assertiveness, I would say, or aggressiveness of China doesn't seem to really have any bounds. So it's not just in the military space; it's also in the economic, the soft power spaces where. To have to either go after Chinese efforts to wield bigger influence becomes more complex. We cannot stovepipe these issues. And Beijing also seems to know that this is part of our calculation. Interestingly, there are, of course, debates about where China stands on the Korea problem. Let's look at how China views North Korea. We know that China will participate in US-led or international efforts to curb North Korean behavior through sanctions or other multilateral and international efforts. China will be supportive only to the extent that it helps its stability, to the extent that it's going to allow Beijing and Xi Jinping to continue to move forward with their own long-term vision. This is why, of course, we've seen China sort of press the brakes to when it feels like it's giving in too much, not to North Korea specifically, but to the United States or to this broader notion of democracy and the free world and this other system that China and the likes, including North Korea, represent. So China will continue to help the United States and the international community to the extent that it's going to find itself more beneficial in a position. But when it comes to actually thinking about the enduring peace, building a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, or at least the broader region, there are questions as to how committed China is. I would also say that we like to talk about China in the context of having leverage over North Korea. While that is it's true, of course, but while that's true, I would also say that if you kind of turn the tables around and question why China is not willing to go all the way to sort of clamp down on North Korea, I think we could also say that there are weak spots or vulnerabilities in China that the United States might also consider in terms of making effective policies and actually finding a way to solve the Korea problem. Number two, Japan. This is kind of a mixed bag, I would say, because Japan currently does not have good relations with a key partner in this trilateral or the trilateral alliance or force, so to speak. South Korea and Japan go through cycles of historical tensions. Under the Moon administration, this has been very actively played upon by the government. It's problematic, not just in terms of dealing with North Korea, but from the US perspective, in the long-term competition or tensions with China, having reliable, consistent partnerships and alliances in the region, we're talking specifically Korea and Japan, adds more weight to the US factor. We try to counterbalance, so US, South Korea, Japan versus China, North Korea, and sometimes Russia. So it's 3 versus 3, and North Korea and China have this advantage called we don't really like to play by the rules. And this behavior has been, it's proven to be really effective. And in my opinion, I don't think that the international community or the United States has actually fully enforced or fully communicated to countries like China and North Korea the consequences of not abiding by the international norms. So the leverage that North Korea has, of course, besides the nuclear weapons, is the fact that it just decides to dismiss any and all rules and just do as it pleases. The United States, South Korea, and Japan at this critical stage need to really form their alliances, tighten it even more, and try to approach the North Korea problem as well as a regional problem more as a united front. But we're not seeing that from our allies in Tokyo and Seoul. Japan has, depending on who you speak to, of course, remained pretty consistent in terms of some of its own historical contentions with North Korea, talking specifically about the abduction issue. But besides that, when you look at China, the United States, South Korea, we sort of typically think of those 3 countries as the more frequently talked about parties to this dilemma called North Korea or the problem of the Korean Peninsula. From Japan's optics, even though Japan might want to play a more active or visible role, because of historical tensions between Japan and South Korea, and also between Japan and North Korea, and then to another extent, Japan and China relations, there doesn't seem to be much room for Tokyo to really insert itself as a critical or very important player in the region. Russia also is it's a mixed bag, I would say. As a country that is situated in Northeast Asia, it still doesn't really have the identity as either a European nation or a Asian nation. However, Russia doesn't really want also to be left behind. So we noticed that when Kim Jong-un was traveling to China and also to Russia to sort of prop up his alliances and to show President Trump and the United States that he also has allies he could turn to, we didn't really see any indications that the North Korean-Russian relationship was actually as robust and as significant as the Pyongyang-Beijing ties. But I wanted to illustrate this because, again, to drive home the point that we look at the map of the Korean Peninsula, it's rather small. The smaller countries even divided into 2 separate countries. But because of nuclear weapons, because of the geopolitical location of the countries, it tends to get overlooked by the China factor, by US-Russia tensions. But we've seen in recent years that this tendency to ignore and to downplay what appears to be a pretty serious and also enduring problem does need to be looked at from, I would say, a broader lens to get a better understanding. So I would say that the great decision on the Korean Peninsula is really no longer fixed entirely on North Korea. Or rather the complications of solving the longer term North Korea issue, matters of peace and reconciliation, have actually been compounded in the contemporary setting. So, researchers, scholars, the North Korean dilemma, actually, we can take a few steps back, outward, widen the aperture, looking at this. The Korean Peninsula issue, it's actually considered, I would say, a multidisciplinary cross-cutting issue. For one, I think I've sort of alluded to this or talked about this previously, but this entails the interests, motivations of more than just a couple actors. And in light of the Kim regime's increasingly internationalizing presence, not to mention, of course, this globalization of its collateral damage, via its illicit networks and activities. So there's a lot of talk about North Korean cyber activities as well. In the cyberspace, the DPRK's cyber activities helped Kim Jong-un, or it helped the regime, harvest about $316 million in cyber attacks, cryptocurrency exchanges from 2019 to 2020. It's a huge number. Cyber has a low cost of entry, but it also has very high yields. You don't have to be a wealthy country to be able to reap a lot of benefits from these activities. There's also challenges in attributing cyber hacking and other activities to a particular country, entity, source. So we often find ourselves discovering North Korean cyber-related activities and footprints only after the fact. Deterring these activities is also a challenge. So it leaves this loophole for actors like North Korea, China, Russia, to continue to exploit. And the targets of these activities, victims, have ranged from not just the US target, but South Korean banks, Japanese financial institutions, even hospitals in the United Kingdom. So the WannaCry virus that took place a few years ago was actually ransomware. You could argue that it was aimed at getting money, but it also caused a huge disruption in hospitals in the United Kingdom, and potentially something like 100 or so other countries where they had actually disseminated this malware. So this was software that really brought operation of critical infrastructure, hospitals, to a standstill. The South Korean government, they estimate that the North Korean Reconnaissance General Bureau has generated or dedicated more than 6,000, 7,000 full-time cyber warriors or cyber operatives who basically it's their job to hack, to spread disinformation, to carry out cyber criminal activities and so forth on a daily basis. So the North Korea problem is not just about the nuclear weapons, the missiles. I did not really talk about the human rights component, but of course there is, I would say that there is one single source of the problem, but connected to this source are other, I guess, tentacles or legs spreading out from this. The weapons, the WMDs is definitely one node. The illicit activities, the increasing presence and reliance on computer-based crimes is also another. There's also North Korea using conventional military tactics to threaten its regional neighbors, precisely South Korea and Japan. I think that because these, the conventional low-level threshold activities, they don't really meet the criteria for actual conflict, and they're also localized to the region. We in the United States typically don't think of the North Korea military problem as something that we have to deal with. But I would say that gradually, by making itself more and more of an aggressive force, by reducing and limiting South Korea and Japan's I guess the strength or the will to really stand up against North Korea. It's also used as part of the Kim regime's elaborate toolkit of weakening US influence in the region, of weakening also the leveraging or the clout of the regional actors. So North Korea's toolkit, it's the possibilities for North Korea to continue to annoy us, to pose a problem, is going to be endless. And the challenge is, of course, how does one actually decide which one to actually focus on, and where does this great decision start, and what is the end goal? So the tilt on the great decision on the Korean Peninsula is also sort of bending, I think, towards the US-South Korea alliance, as well as its future. That is to say, how the United States and South Korea come to define the tone and the parameters of the alliance will, in large part, dictate the outcome of geopolitics in the region, Korean Peninsula, and beyond. So I think that we've been kind of cautious or shy to call a spade until now. Perhaps it's the change in administration, perhaps it's the fact that the South Korean administration has until 2022. So they're also sort of near the end of its terms. But there have been fissures and seams wearing between the United States and South Korea for not just the recent year, but for longer. Let's talk about North Korea policy, of course. The Moon administration's repression of freedom of speech, individual liberties, cracking down on North Korean defector organizations and other human rights activist groups against one, of course, speaking out about the human rights violations of the North Korean regime. Two, also the Moon administration's tendency to protect or to act as this shield against any attack or criticism of the North Korean regime has come under increasing fire and scrutiny. But prior to the discussion about this, when the summitry took place, or before the summitry took place between the United States and North Korea, we saw that South Korea began to assert a position that was that did appear to be diverging from the U.S. position. Of course, that was the emphasis on engagement with North Korea at whatever the cost. One could impose costs even upon the safety and the security of the South Korean people. We saw that last summer when the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Kim Yo-jong, threatened the South Koreans that if they were to keep up their behavior and not listen to the North Koreans, that they will face destruction of some sort. And she even articulated that the Inter-Korean Liaison Office might potentially be a target. And remaining true to her illusions and promises, North Korea did end up demolishing the Inter-Korean Liaison Office. South Korea, the government, was obligated, of course, to respond in some way. But not surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly, the issue actually got kind of fizzled out with time. So the fact that the South Koreans, they're able to, or they're willing to put their own long-term interests, their security, safety of their citizens at risk, not to mention consider or entertain the idea of becoming more and more estranged from the 70-year US-South Korea alliance based on shared values and common threats, does seem to be an actual concern. There are, of course, temporal decisions or temporal differences in policy positions, of course, depending on the political leanings of the US administration and that in South Korea. Policies might not align in the right cycles. However, the path that South Korea has continued to take, not just in dealing with North Korea, but with another issue, which I'll elaborate on soon, should raise more concerns, I think, on the part of US decision makers, as well as, I would say, the US public. So there are also changes in South Korea's fundamental institutions and beliefs. And if so, this could actually, as I said, herald or become this harbinger of deeper, I think, more permanent changes in the way US-Korea relations will sort of shape. The other part I wanted to sort of talk about was we can't really avoid talking about US-China relations in this context. And South Korea seems to be a good example of a country basically caught between two bigger powers. The assumption is that South Korea, just like other countries in the region or Southeast Asia, that are kind of look to the United States as their ally or partner in terms of values and security. And on the other hand, they are economically dependent or have this symbiotic relations with China on the economic front. The conventional, I think, assumption is that South Korea is sort of in that similar bucket. But we also have to look at not just what the government, the leadership is saying about where Seoul is situated. They like to say that we don't want to be put in a position where we have to choose. But when you actually look at a nation's priorities, whether it's economics or security, the answer doesn't seem to be that difficult. And I could be saying this because I'm observing developments from the US perspective. From US interests, our values, democracy, liberal institutions. So of course, I might also be projecting my own expectations into this. However, looking at certain choices that the South Korean government has made, they even alluded to perhaps pursuing options to deepen the South Korea-China military partnership. Imagine what that's going to do to the US-South Korea alliance, the questions about the presence of US troops on the Korean Peninsula, OPCON transition. It's not just a bilateral issue. And one would think that decision makers, policymakers in Korea who have looked at this issue, who have studied this for decades, can actually think a few steps beyond just, friendship versus, economic partnership, but actually think about what this pivot, maybe not an immediate pivot, but a gradual tilting towards China's orbit is actually going to mean, not just in terms of the immediate economic interests, but also future generations, as well as the geopolitical landscape in the region. Of course, the United States, and I guess to a certain extent, even China, cannot directly pressure South Korea to choose a side. But I think, and this is, I'm kind of going off tangent, but I think this is a very important point. A South Korean, political analyst who's actually watched security issues for a long time, posed this question to his own audience. And he said that when you look at the military balance, let's say, between the United States and China, we know that the United States, by virtue of being a democracy, we are an open society. We publish a lot of the information about our military readiness, our technologies. So we're more transparent in our capabilities. Of course, we do keep certain things classified. China, on the other hand, has a tendency to inflate. Even its economic growth indicators are questionable. So by extension, we could assume that China views the United States as its prime competition. The military space is clearly one of sensitivity. So the South Korean expert, let's say, said that any figures that China puts out about its military growth, the PLA's capability, of course, should not be dismissed. But there's a lot of fluff that we sort of need to kind of take off to really get a better assessment of where China's situated. But really, when you actually look at just the naked facts, the United States still maintains military superiority over China. South Korea is still dependent on the United States for security. And I think the concern is growing, especially among those who have served in the Korean War, those who have served in the military, and know a little bit more about what it takes to really either deter or even defeat an enemy. There are concerns that South Korea's defense reform initiatives, for instance, shortening the time of conscription, giving men the option to not actually wear uniform and serve in other ways to sort of check the box off is actually going to even weaken South Korea's readiness even more. From that position, the question then is who, if the South Koreans actually think about security and really survivability as the no-brainer first priority of the country, which country should they be aligning with? And it's a pretty obvious, stark, I think, question that we just sort of, we don't really tend to think about when we're talking about these more, I guess, high-level strategic issues. But when you actually think about the bare necessities and what a nation needs to continue to be a nation and to protect the lives and interests of not just its own people, but the region, and as well as looking out for the interests of their allies and partners, the answer is quite, it's just there. You don't really need to say anything else. So I'm driving at this point because when countries actually say that they're caught between, United States and South Korea, part of that might be true, but I think that we have to question whether there are other motives or intentions behind what they're saying in public versus what's actually going on behind the scenes. And it doesn't even have to be activities going on behind the doors, but they could say something in the press. But to say, we're continuing to strengthen relations or alliance with the United States, linchpin of the alliance and so forth. But you can say one thing and you can pursue another action that sort of contradicts what you're saying and what you're trying to deliver. And this is something that I think is growing more interest in the community, which is reassuring. But I also think that we've been, as I said, we haven't really been able to call a spade until now. So in closing, I guess, peeling back some of the layers to examining issues in the Korean Peninsula through the lens of great decisions, I've tried to demonstrate, I think, a couple of key takeaways. And one, of course, is that the Korean Peninsula is facing a defining era. The focus is no longer on the North Korean threat, and really it should not be. Rather, I think the regional issues and the question about the direction of the US-Korea alliance should actually take even more weight as a big component to solving this problem called Korea. This, I think, calls for the need to examine issues from a different lens. I don't mean to dismiss the conventional issues, the need to strengthen our military capabilities, but with the advent of COVID-19, the pandemic has sort of spread everyone thin. It's having us question even some of the most basic things we took for granted. So it's sort of, I think, magnified some of the issues, and it's also calling for a need to look at problems, not just on North Korea, but any strategic, geopolitical, security problems from a very different lens. But then I would also say that this new lens, of course, has to be tied down to some basis of reality, history, pragmatism. Second, today's geopolitics and the complications compounded by COVID-19, it poses additional challenges to solving the Korea problem. And I think what we need to sort of be more aware of is not just the realities of the Korean Peninsula, the changing dynamics between the parties, where South Korea is economically, politically, even in terms of social institutions, but as citizens, participants, people who work on Korea issues, we also need to sort of think about maybe we're also making assumptions that just do not hold in the present day. I think that requires, of course, taking a step back. I was encouraged to hear that the Biden administration is going to basically do a comprehensive review of their approach to North Korea. Whether that's going to mean a completely different approach, I think remains to be seen. But I think it's at least an awakening that one, our current up to now approach toward North Korea in some ways has worked, but in others it hasn't. So it's an awakening there, but I think it also kind of pushes us to think about problems in a different light. But again, I think the catch here is that you have to be sort of realistic in what we're expecting. Everyone obviously wants peace. We all want, the peaceful coexistence between North and South Korea. We would hope that the North Korean leader would depend less or depend not at all on his country's nuclear and ballistic missiles. But there are steps to get there, and to press urgency and to say, the Korean War has been going on for 7 decades. Now is the time to end it. Doesn't really offer any long-term solutions, but it's more of an emotionally driven approach that I think might appeal to a wider audience. But in terms of sustainability, and if you really do desire peace, then there are certain boxes you have to check off. That's reality, history, pragmatism, and I think also a dose of humility that myself included, we tend to lack, I think, when we look at an issue for several years to several decades. So that's my takeaway, I think, from having studied and growing up in a Korean culture. That was my takeaway. But I do think that this new administration has shown or has given us a glimmer of hope that perhaps this time around, we might not get close to solving the Korea problem in 4 years. I think this is something that is going to take much longer. But I think at least we might be sort of taking a pivot towards a different direction that might sort of smooth over some of the patches and work towards peace on the Korean Peninsula, but also protecting U.S. interests in the region. So with that, I will close and I will open up the floor to any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Sue. That was wonderful. You gave us a lot to think about. And I just want to remind everybody again that if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat room. And that way I can work through them and share them with Kim or Sue. So I threw the first one out there just to kind of get things started. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so we can get rid of the map and then pull everybody else up here. So, okay. But yeah, I just threw the first one out there on the state sponsors of terrorism list. I know George W. Bush took North Korea off, even though he called them part of the axis of evil after 9/11. But he was trying to encourage the six-party talks and kind of put that out as a carrot, I guess. Trump added them back in, even though he was having these summits, and it seemed kind of counterintuitive. But I guess it just raises the question, are they a state sponsor of terrorism, and particularly who they support? You can see someone suggested it was Iran, that they're making a deal for oil for nuclear technology. Can you comment on that?
Sure. This is, of course, just my take, not Iran's or anyone else's, but I think it was a good direction to take to at least symbolically add North Korea to the state sponsored of terrorism list. What was lacking, of course, is the follow-on subsequent action that would sort of indicate to the rest of the world that this is a state sponsor and that the United States, as well as its partners and allies, do take this issue seriously. As for North Korea's actual involvement in terrorism, of course, North Korea is not ISIS, it's not Hezbollah. However, we know that North Korea had or still has contacts with some of these non-state actors that are prone to terrorist tendencies, the selling of arms, the selling of military technology to those countries. I would also say that human rights violations in such mass forms, systematically, knowingly, not just over 2-3 years, but through 3 generations, says a lot about the values or the lack thereof of the system, as well as any prospects of trying to convince the North Korean leadership that, hey, maybe if you were to open up your country, things might actually look better, not just for you, but for your entire population. So I do think that I'm not dismissing the symbolic side of designating a country as X, Y, and Z, but I do think that in order for us to make progress on solving this issue, there needs to be more consistency and not just let's just check this box off and that's it.
Good. Okay, and Sammy asked the question, you mentioned about the Biden administration. What would a new approach by Biden look like that hasn't been tried before?
So we do get a lot of these questions about, I think because the Trump administration has been so unique or unconventional in dealing with North Korea or any other country for that matter, people start to wonder, how different will the Biden administration be in terms of drawing, I guess, red lines with North Korea? Will it hold a summit, for instance? Do you think he will agree to an interim deal and so forth? I think the short answer is nobody still knows. One thing I could say is that given the priority on China and the China threat, we seem to be maybe instinctively or just as observers looking to see how the contours of U.S. policy towards China is being defined. Once that is defined, I think we will have a better sense as to what the limits will be for U.S. involvement in North Korea. In terms of how different it will be, I think we could roll out summits without conditions as one. There are indications also that we might be returning to more sanctions on North Korea. I would also say, though, that sanctions should not just be enforced on the North Korea target, but also these waiting actors that are complicit and that continue to sort of violate the norms. So China, of course, is a big actor. There are also other countries in Southeast Asia, perhaps even in Africa, that are sort of, by virtue of their own political or economic vulnerabilities, find themselves in really no better position than to cooperate with the North Koreans. But again, I think this just underscores the need to look at the North Korea problem, not just through a myopic lens, but through a broader, geopolitical, military, even cyber. And I didn't talk about this, but North Korea also has a very active social media presence. So that's like a generational thing that I think it's appealing to a lot of these younger people who don't necessarily know too much about the history of North Korea, but they're fascinated because it's just a novel concept. So I would hope that the next approach is more comprehensive, but again, pegged to history and pragmatism.
Riley asked a question. Riley's actually writing his capstone thesis in our course this semester on human rights violations in China. And so he asked the question, in your opinion, what policy initiatives, tariffs, sanctions, alliances, et cetera, work best in deterring Chinese involvement in the Korean Peninsula? And do certain Chinese cultural beliefs, etiquette, religion, gender roles affect the way the United States chooses to approach certain issues with China?
So there has been some suggestion that in dealing with both China and also dealing with North Korea, sometimes they're kind of intertwined. The United States might want to impose greater costs on China. So rather than just slapping them on the wrist each time we see a sanctions violation, think about ways we can actually make China pay for its participation. This, of course, includes the sanctions component, but there are also other ways to collectively approach China from a more comprehensive and holistic aspect. The cultural aspect, I think, is something that we talk about a lot, but I think it gets overlooked. I find that to be kind of problematic because not that of course, it's about also understanding the perspectives of the other side, but I think because we tend to impose our own biases and there is, I think, a notion that democracy and liberal institutions are superior in terms of quality, the quality of life that we give. But this might not be the same mentality that the Chinese state, its leadership actually looks at. It might actually think that its system is actually much more superior. And that is why it's continuing to push forward with this long-term plan to exert greater Chinese influence politically, but also culturally. So I think this is where we kind of see the need for more, people who are studying the language and the culture, who've kind of been to the country and actually understand what the thinkers there are thinking about key issues and the United States. The key there is, of course, not to be entirely sympathetic to something that we don't believe in. But I think the key there is to just see where maybe the lines just aren't really matching up. But I think in the recent years, with more connectivity, with new emerging threats that just don't really have a neat box around them, there is this greater appreciation, I think, for the cultural side of not just soft power, but also hard power as well.
Good. Ed asked the question, are you optimistic about our future relations with North Korea?
Oh, that's a hard one. I think I would be optimistic if the United States-South Korea alliance was on a much more solid ground. I don't think that it's entirely hopeless. I think that there are still former experts, bureaucrats, academics, average South Korean citizens who really do value the alliance more than caving into pressures from North Korea or China. But I think the gap, of course, remains that past 4 years has not really been good for South Korea. And it's not just the United States wholly to blame, but I think South Korea was also at times very aware of what the implications would be if Korea were to take a certain step that would be sort of frowned upon or not seen positively by the United States. With the new Biden administration in office, there's been a lot of anticipation from Korea. But I think we need to remind ourselves that there's also the timing element where this is a new 4-year administration. So we're kind of starting out and building a foundation for different policies. Korea, the Moon Jae-in administration started in May of 2017. 2017, yes. And he's going to finish his presidency in 2022. So not much time. So he's on a compressed timeline. Also think about the overall direction he sort of went into domestically and also in terms of foreign policy. So I think to be more optimistic about North Korea and also the alliance, we should look for solutions that sort of go beyond the current Moon administration and just look at the entire geography or topography of South Korean public sentiment, as well as what the elites are thinking as well.
Becky asked, what are the Chinese weaknesses that could be exploited?
So this is, I think, it's debatable because I think some people just see this as a clear black and white issue where China doesn't like to exert leverage, but it still has leverage. And some, myself included, would say that the fact that China is hesitant to just go all the way suggests that there's something in China's own systems, perhaps even its own preparedness to really confront an emboldened North Korea or a confrontation with U.S. troops and South Korean troops. Think about where I think the most obvious example is, of course, the geographical proximity between China and North Korea. Any humanitarian crisis or some sort of instability in North Korea would or might push North Korean refugees up to China. And that is going to be, of course, a humanitarian disaster for China. It's a liability. Along with that, of course, comes stigma as well as political issues. So if China did not have vulnerabilities geographically, financially, economically, why would China continue to encourage at times or even prop up a regime that, frankly, nobody seems to really support? And the regime, despite having these illicit connections with third-party nations, really has no friends. And North Korea can't even really call China a true friend because there are suspicions, I think, that go both ways. So it's a symbiotic relationship, and it's not one that's actually based on a common value system. I think the only value system that they're sort of finding common ground in is that neither country really likes the United States. And I guess that could sort of carry the two countries for a while, but in the end, Kim Jong-un is going to think about his own survivability. He's not going to just cower to China's demands if he feels like he's going to have to forfeit a lot, including his own regime. So the liability there, of course, is North Korea, the geography, the weapons, and so forth. So instead of trying, we of course want to get China involved and also have China sort of sit at the table on our side. But we also need to be thinking about what are some ways that we can actually, I don't want to say threaten, but also try to coerce China by pointing out its own vulnerabilities vis-a-vis North Korea, so that we are actually making progress toward the North Korea issue and making just the region more peaceful.
Good. Sammy, also wanted to follow up on the other issue. Do we know that North Korea has helped Iran in their nuclear efforts? I know we know Pakistan and North Korea had a relationship with helping build North Korea's nuclear weapon from Pakistan. Are we seeing that same relationship with Iran?
So we're seeing that with certain Middle Eastern countries. I don't know how much of that is actually revealed to the open sources, but one would suspect that with North Korean activities proliferating through just all around the world, not just circumscribed to the region, but having international, trade relations. North Korean diplomats are dispatched around the world, and it's not just to engage in diplomatic relations. It's also about these illicit transactions that include the sale of arms and weapons, narcotics that continue to sort of proliferate. So I can't comment directly on the link, but I would suspect that given the vastly proliferating activities of North Korea, weapons, cyber, and so forth, that I think we can sort of do the math.
Ginny asked the question, looking at COVID-19 testing and vaccination as both a health and humanitarian effort, do you think that North Korea will accept the WHO coordinated vaccine program? And if not, why not?
So this is where Kim Jong-un probably, despite being a selfish dictator, cannot completely dismiss the natural happenings of a pandemic. We know that there had been border closures. Trade between North Korea and China declined dramatically. Compounding that, of course, were typhoons and other natural disasters last year. On top of that, there were also sanctions. So he is squeezed pretty thin, and he admitted that his nation's economic development plan actually failed. That's not because he was humble, but that's because there's really no way to sort of avoid reality. Conveniently, he has others to blame, the United States, South Korea, and it does not really matter whether this holds any water, but that's just an argument that he likes to push forward. In terms of North Korea actually accepting vaccines, we saw reports saying that they will be accepting, I think, 2 million or so vaccines from COVAX. I would say that, I wouldn't be too optimistic, not because of the number of vaccines, but because we know that once the vaccines are actually in the country, it's actually not going to go to the people who need it first. Here in the United States, Korea, other countries, we have this tier system where we do prioritize based on health conditions, risk of exposure, but That's not really in North Korea's concerns. It's all about protecting Kim Jong-un, his family, the inner circle, and the elite. So it's one thing for the vaccines to go and actually start helping the North Korean people, but it's an entirely different story if it goes to you know, every human life is important, but at the same time, there needs to be a priority as to who deserves it more and who needs it more based on health conditions. We don't see that in North Korea. And I think the other caution we have to sort of think about is how North Korea is going to portray this, or how Kim Jong-un is going to portray it is you get the vaccine and he's not going to be thanking the international community. This will all just be Kim Jong-un gloating, saying that it was through his leadership prowess and his negotiating abilities that he was able to bring vaccines into the country to save the North Korean people, when in fact it's not really going to trickle all the way to the bottom of the population.
Well, I think we reached the end of the question. So I'm going to ask the last question, and it's simply on a lighter note, because the Great Decisions article spent a couple pages talking about K-pop. And I just wanted to get your read on, first off, do you like K-pop? And other, do you really see it as kind of a cultural diplomacy, or really something that South Korea can kind of leverage in terms of relations with other countries because of this phenomenon right now?
So I will have to say that I actually did not like K-pop, and not because I actually had interest, but I just thought of it as something that was on the other side of the globe. When actually after stubbornness of saying no, and this is really not my type, after listening to BTS, I am actually a fan of BTS, not the army, but I do like the music. In terms of soft power actually helping, I don't think we can dismiss it. Not just looking at South Korea, like the wave of South Korean pop culture, the media, K-beauty, and other cuisines, but because not just law-abiding nations like South Korea, but North Korea is also looking to use soft power, their own version of a young, relatively attractive female as this vlogger walking around the streets of Pyongyang doing candid interviews. So it's one thing if United States, South Korea, Japan, other democratic institutions use pop culture to spread good ideas and cultural values to the world, but it's another if a nefarious actor like North Korea is using it to spread disinformation and to, plant seeds of inaccurate history or reality to younger generations who are going to be, future decision makers and leaders of their respective countries. So that's where I stand. I like soft power, but I think that we have to be more, aware of what we're listening to and what their intentions are.
Great. Well, Sue, thank you so much. This has been great. You've given us a lot to think about. And again, just a very comprehensive overview of the whole situation on the Korean Peninsula, but also extending it into other regions like China and so on. So again, thank you for your time. I'll just remind everybody that this recording will be available on our Great Decisions website. What Jacqueline is actually doing is converting it into a YouTube video, which makes it easier for you to share with other people. So if you would like to share this with others, that will be available within a couple of days on our Great Decisions website. So Sue, thank you again. We appreciate it. Stay safe up in DC, stay warm, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to stay in contact. So thank you again for supporting our program.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you next week when we're going to be talking about China in terms of looking at global supply chain, and particularly the national security implications of that with the COVID-19 situation and all, with Michael Murphy from the Darla Moore School of Business at University of South Carolina will be our speaker next week. So thank you again, everybody. Have a good weekend.